Hello everyone, I'm Brian Rosa, and welcome to Rosa's Trains. Today, we're going to learn the types of locomotive paint schemes and group them into specific categories. Every railroad has its own corporate identity in the form of a logo and its dominant colors. Back then, in the age of steam, most locomotives were painted in black, gray, or some other somber color, but there were a few exceptions. The most notable example of a brightly colorful steamer is the Southern Pacific Daylight Series, painted orange, red, black, and silver. Since the dawn of dieselization, liveries had become more colorful than ever before, not to mention the so-called rainbow era of Amtrak from the 1970s. There are a countless number of paint schemes, especially in North America, some new, some repainted, and some that are obsolete. This is a video guide that will help you classify locomotive paint schemes as new, repainted, ordinary, or unusual. So, without further ado, let's explore the colorful world of trains. We'll begin with paint schemes that are fresh from the factory. I call them delivery schemes. Now, for those of you who are steam buffs, there's not quite a lot of information on steam locomotive paints, so I'm focusing heavily on diesels, which are naturally more colorful. If you can't see a lot of steamers, then don't bother watching this video. I'm sorry. Otherwise, let's move on. A delivery scheme is simply defined as a coat of paint that is placed on a newly assembled locomotive at a factory. This category also applies to locomotives manufactured in-house, meaning those built by a railroad's own shops, like the Pennsylvania Railroad's Altoona Works and the Norfolk and Western's Roanoke shops. The former used to be a subcontractor primarily to General Motors' Electromotive division, whose assembly plant could otherwise not have enough space for such tasks as painting so many locomotives. Sometimes the Altoona Works, later known as the Juniata shops, assembled diesel fleets for its parent railroad with all parts manufactured by EMD. For example, Conrail ordered 81 of the 3,800 horsepower SD60I units, many of which were completed and painted at the Juniata shops, owned by Conrail at the time. Not all delivery schemes that have lasted a long time, because some are rather experimental and would be replaced by a new scheme shortly after. I'll explain more about it in the next chapter of this video you're watching. I love seeing locomotives in their as-delivered schemes, especially those painted for many fallen flag railroads. These days, a lot of Class 1 railroads have sent hundreds and hundreds of locomotives to be modernized or rebuilt. I originally considered classifying rebuild schemes as delivery schemes because modernized units at first glance look new as if they are fresh from the factory, albeit with remanufactured components. However, I have decided to make a separate category for rebuild liveries, but mention it in the same chapter as the delivery paints. Just like new locomotives, some rebuild units have been done in-house. The Juniata shops, now owned by Norfolk Southern, have put out a lot of upgraded diesels, such as the SD60E, the SD70 ACU, the AC44 C6M, the GP33 Eco, etc. Additionally, NS introduced several rebuilds painted in commemorative schemes to represent their respective programs, including DC to AC traction conversions and the 710 Eco upgrades. Whoa, hold on, let's save the so-called heritage units until later. So, the next chapter will cover secondhand liveries and general repaints. A secondhand repaint occurs when a railroad sells a locomotive to another, or if a predecessor railroad is absorbed or merged into a new company. In either case, Most locomotives are immediately renumbered and put into service, but not yet fully repainted to save costs. For that reason, many previously owned units would first be seen with small printing for the new number and the new company initials. These are called patches. Let's talk about post-merger schemes first. When a successor railroad acquires a predecessor, most of the pre-owned units would initially be renumbered and patched while retaining the lettering of an old railroad. For example, the former Southern Pacific and Rio Grande units within the Union Pacific roster had to be partially painted with yellow patches and red print, indicating UP's ownership. When the Conrail assets were divided between the CSX and Norfolk Southern systems in 1999, the Big Blue units were patched with either the yellow numbers of the former or the white/black numbers of the latter. Despite the new owners, many of the remaining ex-Conrail units retained their original logos until they were fully repainted in the CSX or NS schemes. Now, if a Class 1 railroad sells a locomotive to another company, such as a short line, the logos of the former must be scratched off, or at least covered by a strike-through, and then replaced by the new railroad's initials. If necessary, the pre-owned unit may also be renumbered to avoid conflicts with an existing unit on the new owner's roster. While not as big as Class 1 railroads, a lot of short lines have very nice color schemes when their locomotives are fully repainted. Some are owned by holding companies like the Genesee and Wyoming Railroad, whose common colors are orange, yellow, and black. A few other short lines even have paint schemes resembling a fallen flag livery, like the Rio Grande as seen on the Wheeling and Lake Erie Railway, and the Santa Fe blue and yellow scheme used by the Cimarron Valley Railroad. A general repaint from a previous scheme within a single railroad is probably the least essential, but there are some reasons behind it. It can be a revised corporate image, or even a solution to a safety concern. One of my personal favorite examples is the infamous CSX Stealth scheme from the late 1980s. It had a solid gray body, blue chassis, and blue lettering. Although repainted on some existing locomotives, the Stealth was also a delivery scheme applied to newly built diesels, such as the Electromotive SD60 and the General Electric C40-8. Unfortunately, this experimental livery turned out to be poorly visible, so it had to be modified with the familiar yellow nose on some units, or better yet, replaced by a completely new scheme. Generally, when a railroad chooses to rebrand its own logo and/or colors, it's best to create a new paint scheme on an existing locomotive. If a rebranded livery is first applied to an entirely new unit coming from a builder, it could potentially give unsatisfactory results, and the railroad would be responsible for modifying the scheme into a more desirable style. That would be kind of frustrating, eh? There is one notable exception, though. In 2022, Amtrak introduced the Phase 7 livery, which was first painted on a brand new locomotive, the Siemens ALC-42 Charger number 309. As far as I know, the paint scheme looks pretty good. I can't find anything bad about it. Designing a new livery on an existing locomotive also applies to newly merged railroads. Shortly after its 1995 merger, the BNSF Railway initially had two different test schemes, one on an SD70 Mac number 9647, and another on an SD60M number 9297. Both units were originally built for the Burlington Northern Railroad prior to the merger. A much more recent example is from the newly formed Canadian Pacific Kansas City in 2023. As of this video, there is currently no information on what actual locomotive to come first with the CPKC scheme, but I should assume that it would more likely be painted on an existing locomotive rather than a new or even rebuilt unit. That completes the secondhand and general repaints chapter. Now let's move on to the next. A demonstrator unit can be metaphorically described as a pilot episode to a particular locomotive class. Depending on its purpose, it can also be referred to as a prototype or a testbed unit. As its term implies, a demo locomotive is used to test or demonstrate some of the most up-to-date technology for higher horsepower, lower operating and maintenance costs, greater fuel efficiency, increased reliability, and in recent years, minimized exhaust emissions. Most testbed units are often seen near a locomotive factory where they belong and have traveled over various railroads across the United States. Some have also operated at the Federal Railroad Administration's Transportation Technology Center in Pueblo, Colorado. They come in a variety of paint schemes, although some use the same common colors and patterns as each other. Notice the same livery used for EMD's SD60, GP60, and GP59 demo units. A few demonstrators have been sold to several railroads. For example, the GE-9 prototype number 8601 was painted black with a red bottom stripe, and of course the builder logo, as well as the product name. It was eventually sold to the Chicago and Northwestern Railway and repainted in yellow and green while keeping the same number. Sometimes there has been the other way around. Amtrak sent at least 3 of its problematic SDP-40F diesels to EMD, one of which would ultimately be used for testing AC traction technology. Other demonstrator units were painted as if they were delivered to a particular railroad, but they actually belonged to a builder. For instance, GE sent 3 of its pre-production B32-8 units to Burlington Northern for testing -8 technology, such as microprocessor control. Likewise, EMD built a quartet of AC traction SD60 Mac freight units in BN colors for the same railroad, but again, they belong to the manufacturer. Leasing a locomotive is an economical solution to maintain an optimal number of freight trains in the event of a temporary locomotive shortage. While railroads don't have to spend a fortune on new units, a lease agreement varies from several months to only a few years. Lease units are also useful substitutes for regular locomotives that are out of service for a short period of time, typically due to an overhaul or a rebuild. Some leasing companies officially have paint schemes on their own units, whether as a delivery scheme or a repaint. Notable examples include First Union Rail, FURX, CIT Financial Group, and City Rail. However, as mentioned previously, other lease units were previously owned by various railroads and would have patches instead of a full repaint. Locomotive builders also used to have their own leasing services. Electromotive's demonstrator and lease fleets are dubbed as EMDX and EMLX, respectively. The latter is now known as Progress Rail Leasing, PRLX. General Electric's demo and lease rosters are named GE Capital, or GECX, and Locomotive Management Services, LMSX. Sometimes, new locomotives are put into service right out of the assembly line, but not yet painted. Instead, they are temporarily in primer with at least the unit numbers and railroad initials. Occasionally, the builders can be congested with so many engines waiting to be painted. Primer units may be deployed on the railroad to prioritize freight traffic over painting them and to meet customer demands. Some of those naked locomotives have been used particularly by CSX, Kansas City Southern, and Norfolk Southern. In 2012, NS also received 9 of its primer ES44AC units from GE to be painted in their heritage schemes. That completes the demos, leases, and primers chapter. And now for the moment you've all been waiting for. Heritage schemes. As many of you know, a heritage locomotive is painted in a special livery primarily as a tribute to a defunct company that was merged into today's Class 1 railroads. It can also represent a reintroduction of a previous paint scheme that was retired by the same railroad, most notably Amtrak. It should be noted that locomotives that still wear liveries from predecessor lines are not considered to be heritage units. On the contrary, though, I was surprised to see an online Trains magazine article describing those older engines as real heritage locomotives. I'll put a link to it in the description of this video you're watching, so you can read more about them. Some heritage schemes are repainted on existing units, while others were actually painted on newly built units. According to a YouTube video posted by CoasterFan2105, there are 3 methods of designing those commemorative liveries. The first is creative interpretation. While intended to honor a fallen flag railroad, some heritage schemes do not quite match the real ones from the past. Union Pacific repainted and renumbered 6 EMD SD70 ACE diesels in honor of the railroads it purchased over the years, but none of these liveries appear to be the same as the original fallen flag schemes. More recently, CSX has introduced its heritage program by repainting and renumbering several GE ES44AH engines in honor of its predecessor railroads. Despite its recognition of the past, CSX made a controversial decision to paint the cab portion in the ordinary scheme and the rest of the locomotive body in a heritage scheme. For that reason, I consider this example as creative interpretation. The second method of designing a heritage scheme is by recreating an older livery to make it virtually identical to the original. Amtrak started this concept to celebrate its 40th anniversary in 2011 by repainting several GE Genesis diesels, as well as a non-powered F40PH control unit in phases 1, 2, 3, and 4. The next year, Norfolk Southern planned a 20-unit heritage program as part of its 30th anniversary. Of the 20 locomotives, 9 new GE ES44ACs turned out of the factory in primer, but soon painted in their heritage schemes at the railroad shops in Altoona, Pennsylvania and Chattanooga, Tennessee. 1 additional ES44, number 8025, was built in 2010 and later repainted in Monongahela colors to join the heritage fleet. The other 10 locomotives are the EMD SD70 Aces, which were all painted in past railroad schemes at the Progress Rail factory in Muncie, Indiana. The final method of creating heritage liveries is placing small fallen flag logos on a generic paint scheme. This led to the unofficial nickname sticker units. Several years prior to its fully painted heritage units, CSX applied a single predecessor railroad emblem to each of a few units. Each logo is seen on both sides of the wide nose. However, in 2020, BNSF created its own commemorative scheme involving multiple fallen flag logos, along with its 25th anniversary herald. 10 ES44 units are wearing this coat. In addition to heritage schemes, railroads have created other commemorative liveries in honor of military veterans, first responders, and even essential workers of the coronavirus pandemic. I should also mention that during the 1970s, a lot of locomotives were painted in patriotic colors to celebrate the 200th birthday of the United States, known as the Bicentennial. And yes, the most popular example was the American Freedom Train, led by the Southern Pacific GS4 Daylight steam engine, which was temporarily repainted in red, white, and blue. Other patriotic locomotives were unveiled in the early 1990s to honor the U.S. soldiers who served in the Gulf War. The most remarkable unit in that subcategory is a Union Pacific SD40-2, number 3593, painted in the brown and tan camouflage pattern. Some locomotives have been painted in colorful anniversary schemes of related organizations such as Operation Lifesaver and Go Rail. The only diesel wearing the Go Rail logos is a rebuilt Norfolk Southern SD60E, number 6963. In contrast, so many locomotives have been painted with Lifesaver logos. Even regular railroad employees deserve to be appreciated, as evidenced by a UP SD70, number 1111. All the big 6 Class 1 railroads, as well as Amtrak and even several commuter rail agencies, have introduced their own heritage schemes, regardless of the 3 methods I already mentioned. Interestingly, some have their respective locomotives decorated in the same fallen flag. For instance, Norfolk Southern, CSX, and Metra North all have Conrail heritage units. While I'm not covering every special locomotive in this video, I knew that it would never be complete without commemorative liveries. Let's move on to some miscellaneous paint schemes. There are many other unusual paint schemes, which will be covered in this chapter. Let's begin with executive liveries used for office car special or OCS trains. I originally considered classifying them as heritage schemes, but I think some of you may disagree with it, so I've decided to label them as miscellaneous. Virtually all executive schemes are repainted on existing locomotives. I can't think of any of them as new, except for the Burlington Northern SD70 Mac units, which were all delivered in the cream and green paint inspired by the railroad's executive scheme, worn by a former Northern Pacific F unit AB set. In 2007, Norfolk Southern restored an ABBA set and repainted it in a unique black and white livery that resembled the Southern Railway's tuxedo scheme. 14 years later, CSX began repainting all 3 ex-Amtrak F40PH diesels in its executive livery, saluting the old Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, albeit with CSX lettering. Advertisements are usually seen on printed periodicals, televisions, and billboards, but they can also be displayed on buses and even trains. Amtrak and Via Rail Canada are best known for showing ads and promotions on their locomotives. More importantly, several Amtrak California F59 PHI units display rail safety messages to the public. I'm not going to mention every example in this video, but I want to point out that not all paint schemes are liquid, because some are actually made of vinyl wrap. I honestly don't know why some liveries are wrapped instead of painted, but if anybody knows the answer, please tell me in the comments below. Every holiday season, Metra runs a special train called Operation North Pole, sponsored by a non-profit organization of the same name. While most advertisements are seen primarily on passenger trains, a few freight locomotives were painted with logos of intermodal companies. 3 different engines had the Maersk logo and colors: a Santa Fe GP60M, a BNSF SDP40F, and a Norfolk Southern SD40-2. Another engine is a Canadian Pacific ES44, repainted in orange with Hapag-Lloyd logos. Since a lot of trespassers have spray painted graffiti on trains, some were allegedly clever enough to create heritage schemes without permission from railroads. According to a YouTube channel, V12 Productions, those unusual paint schemes are referred to as unsanctioned. In 2018, a PRLX unit, number 4834, a former CSX SD70 Ace, was reportedly patched with the old Chesapeake and Ohio logos. It is unknown whether this was done by a vandal or a legitimate railroad employee. 5 years later, a couple of CSX GP40-2s, numbers 6914 and 6394, had their noses unexpectedly repainted in respective heritage railroads, the Chessie System, and the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac. Again, whoever did this action is unknown, but it can be argued that it was a way to make fun of CSX's actual heritage locomotive program, as the company chose not to paint the cab portion of each unit with a matching livery. While vandalism is strictly prohibited by law, it's inevitable that there may occasionally be more unsanctioned paint schemes. We'll never know. When it comes to Hollywood movies, trains are no strangers to live-action filmmaking. While a few retained their real-life paint schemes, others had to be repainted in fictional liveries for this purpose. There are two notable examples that come to mind. In 1976, 20th Century Fox released Silver Streak, starring Gene Wilder and Richard Pryor. Instead of using an Amtrak train, the film had to borrow two Canadian Pacific FP7A units and re-lettered them as Amroad. In the 2010 film, Unstoppable, starring Denzel Washington and Chris Pine, another fictional scheme was created. The Allegheny and West Virginia Railroad, AWVR. For those of you who don't know, this movie is an allusion to a runaway train incident involving CSX SD40-2, number 8888, back in 2001. The rescuing locomotive slowing the train down was 8392, also an SD40-2. In the movie, the runaway unit was an AC4400 CW, number 777, while the hero unit was, indeed, an SD40-2, number 1206. It's interesting to note that both Silver Streak and Unstoppable were not only distributed by 20th Century Fox, but they also borrowed locomotives from the same railroad, Canadian Pacific. These are some of the most unusual paint schemes ever to exist. Here is one bonus chapter as the grand finale of this video you're watching. In a world of toy trains and model railroading, there are some paint schemes that are not necessarily meant to be real, but rather creating a what-if illusion. So we call them fantasy schemes. Now I understand that some nitpicky hobbyists hate them, but in my opinion, model trains would probably not be a lot of fun without some magic. Let's start off with O-Gauge, which is what I run at home. Fantasy schemes are usually more suitable on semi-scale O-Gauge trains, as they are not intended to be realistically detailed like a full-scale prototypical locomotive would. You might have seen a lot of them painted in colors of Christmas, other than the ones in the ever-popular Polar Express, as well as Halloween, military and space themes, and Area 51 aliens. In recent years, though, Lionel has applied those liveries to a lot more of its legacy-equipped O-scale engines than before, not just those toy-like engines for people who are on a budget. As far as I know, many fantasy-painted legacy locomotives have been pretty good sellers. However, it is important for Lionel to establish a build-to-order system involving a minimum number of pre-orders required to make a particular model. So, if the order count is below the minimum by a deadline, the company will not be able to manufacture the item. Other than for fun, the main reason there are so many trains in fantasy schemes is to represent a what-if appearance based on a locomotive that was never purchased by a railroad, or a locomotive that was purchased but not painted in a particular livery. For example, here's a Southern Pacific AC6000 CW diesel in O scale. Although it is considered a fantasy engine, it's actually based on the fact that SP originally placed an order for 3 units, but they never rolled out of the factory with their scarlet and gray paint. This was due to the Union Pacific acquiring the SP in 1996. So, the cancelled AC6000 units would ultimately be painted in UP colors. Lionel is not the only model train brand creating fantasy schemes. I have also seen Athearn doing a similar thing to its HO scale locomotives. This product line is called Legendary Liveries. My personal favorite example is an EMD SD80 Mac, painted in Chicago and Northwestern colors. The CNW attempted to buy 15 units of that breed, but the order was cancelled after Union Pacific took over that railroad in 1995, a year before Southern Pacific joined in the merger. Instead, UP preferred the 6,000 horsepower EMD SD90 Mac, which is 1,000 horses more than the SD80. Sometimes we see models that are unpainted, and I mean not painted at all, and they are also unnumbered. Although some are just engineering samples for demonstration purposes, others can be available for purchase. Depending on the train brand, the consumer may or may not be allowed to custom paint a particular engine. For instance, Lionel has been offering a lot of undecorated O-scale pilot steam engines, so hobbyists can appreciate the craftsmanship behind those precision models. They can even identify which details are molded into the body and which ones are separately applied. To my knowledge, the Lionel pilot models are not intended to be painted after purchase, because they all feature a protective coating on every plane surface. While steam locomotive models are made of die-cast metal or brass, most diesels use plastic bodies. I think I've only seen unpainted diesels in HO and N scale for consumers, but not so likely in O gauge, except for engineering purposes. Perhaps it would be cool if Lionel considered offering undecorated O gauge diesels in the future. What do you think? And now, here's an honorary mention of a fantasy paint scheme to close not only this chapter, but the entire video. This is the Santa Fe Black Bonnet. It all started during the post-war era when Lionel first introduced the Locomotive F3 diesel in the 1948 catalog. It was initially offered in 2 railroad names, New York Central and Santa Fe. As we all know, the latter was supposed to be painted in the red and silver war bonnet scheme, but the locomotive, as illustrated, was incorrectly colored red and black. To the best of my knowledge, this was considered to be a mistake in the catalog. If anybody has additional info about it, please leave a comment below. By the time Lionel started production of the F3, the issue was soon addressed, and all these Santa Fe diesels were painted in the proper war bonnet colors. However, the red and black scheme would ultimately be called the Black Bonnet by hobbyists, and it became a reality when Lionel decided to put it on an F3 ABA set for the 2013 catalog. Since then, this what-if scheme was applied to other locomotives, especially the so-called custom runs that are exclusively sold from Patrick's Trains, a dealer based in Wheeling, West Virginia. Phew, that's a lot of paint schemes featured in one video. I hope you've enjoyed learning about them, since I spent so much time making this presentation as accurate as possible. I really had a lot of fun with it, nonetheless. If you'd like to support La Rosa's trains, I would greatly appreciate it. That can be done through my Patreon page at patreon.com/LaRosasTrains. Patrons will receive exclusive benefits, which are all explained directly on this page. Link in the description. Your contribution, regardless of your preferred membership, is essential not only to me, but to the future of La Rosa's Trains. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and be sure to hit the subscribe button so you can see what's coming up next from this channel. Anyway, that's all for now, and as always, thanks for watching. I'm Brian La Rosa, and I'll see you next time.